In the Hearts of Men by Proser132, Chapter 6. Habit. Aster looked over the arrayed paint bottles with a discerning eye, judging color contrasts and light reflections before deciding that this was the best he could possibly do. He'd worked hard on this for longer than he'd thought he would have to, but he'd succeeded. He grinned himself. Perfect, he declared aloud just as the sweet chime of his newest ward rang in his ear, and his heart began to beat just that tiniest bit faster. It was still a trick, even a year later, to get Jack to come to his warren. Aster hadn't really expected any different. Jack had spent 200-some years completely alone, and after 68, a lot of the indifference had morphed to outright hostility. Not that Aster, dance-tosser that he was, had even known. Jack wouldn't be comfortable in most any place for a long time. The idea of it still made Aster's teeth clench, and likely would for the rest of his life. Still, he'd had much more success in drawing Jack in than any of the other Guardians, likely due to their interactions from before the pitch blew. North had made some tentative progress, and Tooth had given Jack his memory box as a silent apology for having been taken in like everyone else. Aster tried not to think too much about that part, that Jack hadn't even had his memories, hadn't even known who he was. Aster pitched that thought back in the direction it had come. It was precisely as effective a tactic as his not thinking about it pile, which tended to spill over at inopportune times. But if he thought too much about how Jack had suffered, an ugly anger awoke in him. It was vast and hulking, misshapen, and pulsing. Jack didn't need Aster's anger, directionless as it had to be with its subject imprisoned and inactive. He needed... Well, Aster wasn't sure what he needed. Regardless, Jack had the memories back, even if he hadn't told anyone about them yet, and that was his right, Aster figured. He was curious. Of course he was. As in stars, he was alive! But he kept the curiosity as tightly caged as the anger. Maybe someday he'd have the right to express either of them in more than his private thoughts, but that time wasn't now. Even so, Aster found himself directing more glares in the direction of the moon than he had in centuries. It was the only concession he felt comfortable making to his own conflicted feelings. Sandy was Jack's second favorite amongst them. The fact that Jack had referred to Aster as his favorite, according to North, still made Aster want to smile. He was well aware he was as obvious as a shag on a rock, but so long as his friends held their tongues, which they had, he didn't much care. Jack had taken to Sandy's shorthand with a quickness that was surprising, and sometimes they tugged back and forth in it, frost patterns and snowy shapes, matching sand gold swirls. Aster thought that was wonderful. Sandy had never had that, not in Aster's memory of their time as guardians. Sometimes Sandy would sign in the curves and hollow shapes of Pukin, which Jack seemed to take as another permutation of the shorthand he was being taught. Aster pretended it didn't make him stop dead every time he saw it, and if either of them noticed, they did him the great service of pretending they didn't. Not that Jack wouldn't know the significance, mind. Aster still didn't know how to breach the distance, how to talk about the many things Jack should know, that Aster wanted him to know, how to ask about the things he wanted to know. He knew he had time, but there was some impatience in him as well, selfish and small. Hadn't he waited eons? Couldn't he just... But no, he had waited. Yes, another century or two, time enough for Jack to become comfortable, to build himself a life in the world that wasn't full of pain and distance. It wasn't so much a wait as a held breath in the vast count of Aster's years. He could wait longer. Besides, the discussion of what Aster was, an alien on this planet who had shaped it and cared for it, who came from a species that only loved once in their incredibly long lives, who loved Jack... Impatience and longing aside, Aster knew that was a lot to drop on anyone. Much less all at once, which was why he wouldn't. Pieces, slow and steady, the way he ought, but not yet. That said, there was something he could do now, or at least something he could start. Aster smiled at the paints carefully arrayed in their little bottles, awaiting the hand that would take them up. Sometimes it was best to try speaking in a language someone understood. Aster stood and went to meet Jack. Jack entered the tunnel nearest the lake, humming under his breath, and a giddy feeling in his chest that was probably only half the way the wind was bouncing him around. Life was pretty good, he reflected, floating down the tunnel he'd entered towards the main hub of the warren, spinning his staff lazily in his hand. The tunnel was wide around him, safe and inviting, with soft sunlight and soft moss, grass carpeting the floor, and flowers bobbing their heads, and he grinned around at it. It looked as happy as he felt. After all, he had friends now. Sandy with his golden speaking and awesome stories, North and all the Yetis, even if he couldn't take the noise of the workshop for very long, Tooth and Baby Tooth, all the fairies, the kids in Burgess who believed in him and had played all winter long, the best winter he'd ever had, Aster and his living wonderful warren. Jack sighed aloud, the happy sound absorbed by the plants and the walls. Sure, it was a little much sometimes. But even then, Jack figured too much was way better than nothing at all, the way it had been for so long. North and Tooth for sure erred too often on the sign of apology, like he had it forgiven them 10 times over. They'd never been among the number of people who had said cruel things to him or attacked him. Jack knew very well how Pitch could creep inside someone's head now. For a moment his mood dropped, remembering Pitch, but it didn't last long. His happiness took a lot to sink these days. They'd taken Pitch down into his own lair, and there they locked him up. It was an amazing thing the way they had, and in a weird way, Jack was sad more people would never see it, not because he thought people should gawk at a guy who was locked up. He was a bad guy, not a zoo animal. But the prison itself, it was beautiful in a way Jack hadn't realized something like that could be. Aster and Sandy had been the main forces behind it, from the way it was explained to Jack. He had a long way to go before he was anything like a magic theorist for sure, and he understood the basics of what they'd done. All of the things they guarded, the wonder and memories, the dreams and hope, the still unnamed light that lived perpetually in Jack's chest now, were opposed to fear in some way. But there was some kind of history between Sandy, Aster, and Pitch, glossed over in the explanation, which Jack burned with curiosity over, but didn't ask after, that made good dreams and hope a bit stronger against it. And so Aster and Sandy had worked together, weaving a great cage for Pitch, who would lay sleeping inside until Sandy said otherwise. Golden light and twining branches, flowing sand thick with flowers and berries and thorns alike, now grew underground. It glowed and lit up the space, leaving almost no shadows, and Jack imagined that even if Pitch managed to wake up, he wouldn't get far. Jack wouldn't admit it. He's a guardian now. Guardians aren't supposed to be scared. But the thought that Pitch was imprisoned, kept away from the world, made him feel better. No more whispering in people's ears. No one trying to kill Jack's friends, so recently won and so tenuous. They were safe, even if just for a little while. And it meant Jack could relax. Not much, but a little. Still, there was a lot of work to be done. A lot of the animosity towards Christmas had to be repaired, the teeth collected, good dreams delivered, and now the eggs painted and hidden a whole year later. Jack helped as much as he could. Everywhere that could feasibly have a white Christmas that year had one. Global warming be screwed. Jack had sent snow days after Sandy Sand so kids could sleep in and enjoy their dreams. Even Tooth had gotten frost on the windows, little drawings done by tiny fairy fingers, teeth and coins, and even self-portraits of the fairies left behind as little hellos to the children inside. Even so, Jack knew that the winter would run pretty firmly into Easter territory. He'd pulled back on most of the storms as March had started, but most of North America, Europe, and Northern Asia was still thick with white. Jack was trying to gentle it as they moved towards spring, but the season always did have thoughts of its own, and he'd encouraged it a bit too much early on. It was his own fault, and it had been hard not to sink into the tar-thick guilt when he'd realized. So when Aster had begun talking about how he'd increased production on his eggs, and could probably use a second set of hands with all the extra googs running around, Jack had been all too eager to accept the second Aster asked him if he'd want to lend his time. It had been a sort of quiet question, the faint edge of nerves in Aster's voice, and Jack wouldn't have said no, even if he'd had other places to be. It was just... Aster had told him he was always welcome in the warren, and Jack knew it. He did. He just wasn't sure what he was supposed to do once he was there. So far, he'd only come when asked, which he knew was a small miracle in and of itself, and not on his part. Jack had been completely unaware that Aster didn't let anyone in until last year during the absolute wreck that Jack had made of Easter. It was kind of a petty thing, but it made Jack feel special. Aster had liked him that much, had trusted him that much, all the way back in 1970. Jack couldn't say that, really, since he knew it sounded kind of weird. Even so, it was knowledge that he kept close in him, right beside the light that was perpetually flickering, as warm as sunlight reflected off ice in his chest now. Aster kept asking him to come by once every few months. There was always something to do when Aster asked. Gardening stuff like watering, usually, which was something Jack could do now, no longer prone to freezing everything he touched. Jack was just happy to be useful, even if Aster spent the entire time telling him that he didn't have to help, which was weird to Jack. What else was he supposed to do there, especially if there were things that needed doing? It wasn't like Jack was a workaholic, not the way Tooth seemed to be, or any of the others, always focused on their duties. It was more that when he didn't have something to do, he got antsy. Plus, if he was helping out, he could linger in the warren longer and not feel weird about it. In a way, he knew he was still waiting for Aster to kick him out, to change his mind. Jack tried his best not to ignore those thoughts, just remind himself that they were wrong. A lot of things had been proven wrong in the past year, including things he thought about himself and the way other people thought about him. Why not these two? What reason would Aster have to kick him out, since Jack had been on his best behavior? No matter how tempting it was sometimes to play a prank, he always refrained. He had a feeling Aster wouldn't appreciate it. He spun around a giant boulder in the path, the wind bouncing him higher and dropping him almost to the grass before picking him up. She liked the warren too, for reasons Jack didn't really understand. He still wasn't sure if it was actually underground or not, and hadn't asked. He hadn't asked a lot of the questions that sat on his tongue, trying not to be too nosy, but oh man, were there a lot of questions! Sometimes he felt like he was going to burst with them, and Sandy could only answer so much through his symbols, which Jack was still learning. Some things made perfect sense to Jack. Little pictures that were clear as daylight. A snowflake meant he was talking about Jack. A tooth and a candy cane for Tooth and North respectively. A little star for himself, and a crescent moon for the man in the moon. An egg for Bunny, but sometimes it was a star-like flower, especially if Jack had just said Aster's name. An Aster for Aster. Sometimes, though, the shapes turned into stuff that looked like... Well, Jack didn't know. He'd never seen them before, other than a hazy memory of Sandy's last and first words back when they were fighting Pitch, and even then they didn't seem to make sense. It had a bunch of curves and dots and lines and circles arrayed in shapes, and Jack was picking it apart bit by bit, but it was slow going, with only a little bit of help from Sandy. He seemed to be saying more when he used that stuff, though, so Jack was persevering. He didn't know if it was Sandy's language or what, but at least it was interesting. Really didn't help with the questions, though, and Jack was pretty sure he could ask North or Tooth or Aster some of them, but... Well, North was still too boisterous and loud for Jack sometimes, much less the one time Jack had asked a harmless question and ended up 2 hours later fleeing through a window to escape what sounded like a freaking sermon or some kind of lecture. He'd long ago lost the thread of what was going on. Tooth was fun, in a rapid-fire kind of way. Baby Tooth giggling in his ear, and way smarter than her giggly exterior, would tell you. But she was always half-focused, perpetually busy with collecting the teeth, and she wasn't always the best of keeping track of what question she was supposed to be answering. And Aster? Jack had a feeling Aster could answer just about any question Jack threw at him, and even make it make sense, once Jack was done parsing the slang that Aster seemed to have his entire vocabulary drenched in. But Jack already had spent more time with him than almost all of the other guardians combined. Hours and hours, days of cumulative time spent in the warren, watering and talking about nothing, quietly enjoying his company, and he didn't want to ask all of his questions and take up even more of his time. Jack wasn't sure how to talk about a lot of things with Aster. It felt like they'd somehow ended up frozen at the small talk stage and couldn't figure out how to get past that. Jack knew more about plants now than he ever had, the ways the eggplants grew and how Aster cared for them. Jack had probably rambled on enough about weather patterns to bore Aster to tears. It was like every time he thought of a question that went deeper than that, his voice froze up and they dropped off into silence. Around another curve, and Jack knew they were nearing the warren itself. There was a scent to it, heavy water and thick dirt, green things like grass and trees, flower scents that Jack was beginning to know by rote, lilac and myrtle, acacia and crabapple. Aster liked flowering trees, apparently, and Jack liked the branches seemingly shaped for sitting, though he did his best to curb the impulse. Jack's face broke into a wider grin. Speaking of apple, he entered the warren at last amidst the fall of a white magnolia tree. The sunlight was in thick bands as ever, and Jack tilted his head back, squinting up. It was green, 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 as far as you could see, broken by spots of sunlight and sky blue. So underground, Jack decided at last, but only technically. Open to the sky. Jack wondered what it looked like from above. Oi, frostbite! Jack's grin grew still more. He knew Aster had meant it as a rebuttal to every rabbit joke Jack had made, but it was a nickname for Jack! There was no way Jack wouldn't like it. Hi, Cottontail! Jack called, twisting in the wind's grip to glance down. Aster waited below, paw shading his eyes as he squinted up into the sunlight Jack was in. I'm not late, am I? Can't be late if I didn't give you a time, Aster pointed out, and Jack descended, unable to keep his grin off his face. So, come on, I'm waiting. Jack thought back on the last chocolate Aster had given him, the thick milk chocolate, and so sweet it could have been too much, if not for the tart apple caramel in the middle, breaking through the cream and delightfully chewy. Still, nope, not my favorite, Jack said, leaning back in the air, crossing his arms behind his head and resting his neck against the wood of his staff. Still really good, though. Apple caramel, that was a new one for me. I'm used to hearing caramel apple. Aster growled, paw dropping to cover his eyes. Yeah, the most difficult thing alive, he groused, and Jack laughed, delighted with it. He knew Aster didn't mean it in a bad way. He trusted Aster not to mean it in a bad way. Well, now that we got my humiliation out of the way, are you ready? There was a little dip of nervousness in Jack's stomach, but it didn't outweigh his happiness. He knew this was different from last time. Hand painting was going to be a lot harder than dunking eggs in dye and glittering them up. Ain't no dramas, Aster said, interrupting Jack's thought process, which must have been all over his face, he realized. Don't tell Nick, but it's easier than it looks. Jack laughed again. I'm pretty sure that's just you, Bun-Bun, but I got it. Mum's the word, he said, and pressed his finger to his lips. Aster rolled his eyes, but didn't argue. Let's wait, Frostbite. I've got a sit-up for you so that you're not hunting all over me warren for what you need, he said, sounding cheerful about it. Jack smiled, a bit touched. That was actually really nice of him, he thought, as he sat down on the grass, the wind curled around him before dissipating. Not that Jack would mind doing that, but it was nice that Aster had thought ahead. Reckon you wouldn't want to get too fancy, Aster was saying, already turning and beginning to lope back the way he'd come. So I gave you a bunch of colours instead of giving you a few and making you mix new colours as you think of them. They're grouped by a couple of different palettes, so you won't have to worry about colour matching either. Patterns are good, stripes and dots, swirls, that sort of thing. Simple stuff sounds out the best I've found, and there's nothing wrong with a solid colour goo, in my opinion. Jack followed him, trotting to keep up. He didn't mind. He spent so much of his life in the air that it was kind of nice to be firmly on the ground for once. This sounds easy, I guess, he said, and smiled when Aster glanced back at him. I don't think I can mess that up too badly. No, but I don't reckon you'll mess it up, even if I told you to do more difficult things, Aster said, snorting and looking forward again. You pick things up quick, Jack. Jack blinked, a little taken aback at the offhand praise. He thought he'd be used to it after a year, but it still caught him by surprise every time. Aster did that a lot, thoughtlessly saying nice things that he didn't seem to think much of. Wait, not that he didn't think much of them. It was more like he thought they were obvious, that Jack was good at things. It was strange to hear, but Jack didn't know how to say so without sounding like he was fishing for compliments or something, so he tended to pretend he hadn't heard them. He remembered each one, though. Through here, Aster said, and ducked under the low swoop of a thick dogwood branch. Jack took a second to admire the tree. They got so big here in the warren. Everything did, from the trees to the flowers to the tall, rippling grass, before following, sliding his hand along the bark. Like whenever he touched a tree, there was a little jump in his fingers, waiting to spread frost over the blank canvas, but it was almost immediately reined in, long before the magic had a chance to do anything. Since he'd fought Pitch, since he'd gotten his memories back and repaired his staff, his control was almost automatic. Knowing who he was gave him a focus he'd always known he was lacking, a sense of purpose. He still took a long time to process some stuff. It had taken at least 6 months before he'd worked through just the events of those crazy 3 days, and the feelings? Definitely still a work in progress. There was, in fact, some stuff he was trying his best not to get through just yet, because he wasn't even sure what to call the emotions that roiled when he thought about it, and he wanted to at least have a name for them before he tried to tackle them. Most of them involved Aster. He wasn't sure what to make of that either. He landed in a wide-ceilinged room. The warren was pretty evenly divided between rooms tunneled into the earth, Jack had learned over the past while, and rooms like this, constructed more of branch and leaf than anything else. The ground was largely clear of growth, mostly bare dirt, and there were some of the low chairs Aster seemed to favor, probably more comfortable for his legs, Jack thought sensibly, surrounded by tables that matched the height. There was a swarm of eggs bumping into one another and looking like they were full of energy. They filled a good third of the room, and Jack tried to count them in his head before giving up. There were a lot. "It's all right, Jack," Aster said, and Jack looked over at him to find he was watching, green eyes kind. "Looks like a lot, I know, but it goes fast once you're in the swing of things." Jack took a deep breath, let it out, grinned at Aster. "All right," he said, and flopped down on one of the little chairs. Surprisingly comfortable, he'd found, especially with the way he preferred to crouch on things anyway. "How big can it be?" Aster grinned back and only just managed not to make audible the laughter in his throat. "There you go, Frostbite," he said. "Now, I've got to go get some of the other gooks, but I'll be back in a bit. Don't let them give you the runaround, yeah?" Jack nodded up at him and turned to pick up his brush, and Aster left the tree room before his laughter would betray him. Jack was a little nervous about being left alone with the eggs, but he figured painting them couldn't go too poorly, and so when Aster bounded out of the room, a bit of a pinched look to his gaze, Jack just reached for his brush. He'd look a little pinched too if he was relying on someone else to help him with his holiday. If he had one. Maybe if someone tried to help him make a storm? There wasn't a good analogy here, so he shook the thought away and focused on the eggs. Last time he'd been here around them, they'd been spectacularly skittish, and he didn't want to spend all day chasing them again. So he bent over, laid his hand palm up on the ground, and looked at the herd of eggs shuffling around now that their master, who knew, was gone. "Hey," Jack said softly, and most of them seemed to orient on him. They didn't have any kind of face, thank God, Jack thought as he tried to mentally picture that. But they seemed to be able to understand him. "Who wants to go first?" A pause, and Jack waited patiently. But sooner than he'd thought, one skittered over and took a seat in his palm, docile as you please. "Huh?" Jack said, bewildered, and sat up, carrying the egg as he went. It made no attempts to escape, and like the others had been waiting to be sure it was safe, the herd swarmed over, bumping at Jack's calves and jostling for position. "Hey, hey!" Jack laughed, delighted. "You'll all get your turn, promise! Let's just do one at a time, okay?" Considering the colors Aster had set out, and wow, did Aster have an eye for color. Jack liked all of them, greens and yellows and soft pinks, blues and reds so bright, Jack had only ever seen their like in sunsets. Jack dipped his brush into a pretty purple bottle and lifted it back out. The color swirled a bit, excess dripping back into the glass, and he decided he knew this color. It was like the edge of violets, vibrant and just the tiniest bit blue. The egg held very still while he applied the paint, frowning as he worked. Too thin and it was translucent, but too thick and it looked gloppy. After a few minutes he had it covered to his satisfaction, remembering Aster had said it was okay to have some solid-colored eggs, and set the egg back down on the ground. The other eggs had settled down, seemingly watching, and there was a moment where the violet egg was the center of attention, being inspected. Then, making Jack laugh, it leapt into the air and did a happy twirl before skittering off into the crowd, pleased with its new paint. The other eggs began to jostle for attention again, and Jack was just glad he wouldn't have to chase them this time. He picked up another one and got to work. Green stripes on a yellow background, a spotted blue and lavender, red and orange swirls chasing across an unpainted shell. Aster had been right, it did start to go fast. Jack lost count of how many he'd done, focused on the new egg, trying to see how many he could go through before he repeated one. He kept humming under his breath, brush moving over the shells in what he thought was some satisfaction. were becoming practiced strokes. The tune in his throat slowly acquired words until he heard himself murmuring emerald green on his brush. King of green, when the leaves all fall, is still a spring. That kept happening lately, he thought, setting the green and purple egg aside and letting the next scramble into his hand. The eggs were really well behaved, he noted. Last year must have been some kind of fluke, maybe? Or maybe they just liked him. He rinsed the brush off and took up some pale sky blue, beginning to swirl it over the shell in loops, and kept humming. His sister had sang a lot, he remembered. She'd spent most of her childhood, the part Jack was there for anyway, very happy. For that matter, so would Jack. Not everything had been roses. Sometimes crops didn't go well, and when he hadn't been goofing off, he'd been working hard. He'd had to. They'd all had to. Even so, life had been good. He knew the others wondered, and it wasn't like he was keeping it secret because it wasn't good, or even that he didn't want to tell them. For the first time since the memories had been made, Jack felt like he finally had people who would listen. Tooth definitely would. She had made more than one offer to talk to him about it when he was ready, as a matter of fact. Sandy was the best listener, and not even because of the not vocal thing. He always knew when to prompt, when to wait, when to make the right face. And North was the only other human amongst them, Jack thought, and might understand the best. Tooth was maybe part human? He wasn't sure about that. He began to add bright yellow dots in the center of each loop. It was just that, he had someone else he wanted to tell first, and he wasn't sure how to talk to Aster about it. About anything. He looked up as he set the blue and yellow egg down, wondering if he'd already done horizontal rose stripes on the dark blue, then paused. He must have done less than he'd thought he had, because the herd didn't seem to be any smaller. He didn't think he'd done a lot, really, but he'd thought there would be more of a dent in the number. More importantly, though, none of the eggs he'd painted were around, save the blue and yellow, who was bumping into the crowd, pleased with its new colors. He didn't think he'd seen any of them leave, but he'd been focused on painting. He could have missed it. He stood up, careful on the eggs still gathered around his feet, and looked around. No, nothing but white shells as far as the eye could see. Hey, did you guys see where the others went? Jack asked, crouching down. The eggs seemed to bump into each other bewilderedly. Jack was getting pretty good at figuring out non-verbal things by now, though. Maybe Tooth and Sandy helped a lot with that. And so he clarified, You know the painted ones? More confused bumping. One of the eggs tottered forward and bumped purposefully into his knee, and he picked it up. You got an idea? The egg swayed back and forth, but when he tried to put it back down, it refused to be shooed from his palm. Jack sighed. He should have known they wouldn't behave for him forever. Okay, he said, frowning as he stood again and picked up his staff with his free hand. Let's go find them before they get into trouble or something. The egg bounced a bit in his palm, but Jack rolled his eyes and set the little thing on his shoulder, where his sweatshirt would cup it and keep it safe. Yeah, I know. I'll paint you when we get back, he said, and whistled a bit under his breath. The wind came, lifting him off the ground gently, and the egg began to shake. Jack pulled up his hood, even though it was really too warm to be wearing it down in the warren, and the egg relaxed. The wind blew him free of the dogwood tree, leaving behind the unpainted eggs. He hoped they'd wait for him, or he'd just have to herd them all back together when he found the missing ones. Then he paused for a moment, hanging high above the warren. It was big. He knew that already. He never flown so high here, though, never gotten to see the scope of the landscape. Green rolling hills and cliffs and stones, trees in clusters and standing alone, fields of flowers and fanning leaves of plants he didn't know the names to yet. The yet sat kind of funnily at the end of that sentence, and Jack examined it for a moment. It felt weirdly inevitable, he decided at last, and he just wasn't used to inevitability in his life. That was all. He turned his gaze away from the landscape and began to look. Under trees, though not into the rooms they made, since that felt too much like snooping, and over the river of dye behind the stone egg sentinels. Their faces had grown familiar to him as he'd spent time here, and now he even had favorites. He wasn't sure how far he'd gone, but he wasn't finding what he was looking for. He saw painted eggs for certain, things Aster must have done already, designs already painted on and way more complex than anything Jack had attempted, but none of his own, not even the solid violet one he'd painted first, which should have stuck out like a sore thumb. He wondered where Aster had gotten to, but he didn't see him either. Jack huffed, frustrated, and tried to ignore the tiny bit of panic that had taken up residence in his gut. He hadn't lost them. They'd run off. And Jack was looking, unless he was supposed to be painting? Was he screwing up Aster's schedule? The wind bounced him a little, jostling him out of the spiraling train of thought. She was right, there was no use to panicking. He'd just have to keep looking. The egg that had insisted on tagging along was butting insistently into Jack's ear, and Jack scooped it out of his hood, shaking it back with a bit of relief. It really was quite warm. "Look, buddy," he said, tucking his staff under his arm and settling into the wind to float on his back. He set the egg on his chest and watched as it stood up on its little legs wobbly before sitting down with a little drop. It had clearly decided that was the safest course of action. "I know you want to be painted, but you've got to wait until we find the others who've already been painted, okay?" The egg bounced but gave no other response. Jack sighed. "Okay, back into the hood," he said, scooping it up again. "We're going to find the Easter Bunny." The egg went peacefully, but it was Jack's fingers that were shaking, only a little, and he didn't really expect Aster would be mad. To be honest, he wasn't worried about that. What made his stomach swoop was the idea that Aster would be disappointed. Jack had failed him so spectacularly last year, and he'd wanted so badly to make up for it, even just a little. But he couldn't even paint eggs without messing up. He shook the thoughts away because they weren't doing any good, and descended down to the ground, palming his staff again. "If I was a giant rabbit person," Jack said, stumbling over the words. Aster wasn't really a rabbit, was he? He just looked like one. "Where would I be?" He thought about it. Aster clearly was painting somewhere. Probably got distracted, Jack thought fondly. He'd seen the way Aster could get laser focused on something. It was hilarious. But where? Jack frowned. He'd said he was gathering eggs when he'd left, so probably near the eggplants? Jack knew where the biggest field of them was, at least, so he could start looking there. He began to walk and told himself it wasn't to put off the bad news. He passed flowering fields and flowering trees, colors bright and scent strong. It helped, surprisingly, or not surprisingly. Jack loved the Warren. Of course it made him feel better. As he went, he kept an eye out for the eggs that had gone missing, but though he saw more and more painted eggs, he didn't see any of his. He picked up one as he passed and squinted at it. That looked like the words Sandy had been signing more and more often. Did Aster know that language too? He knew one of the words in the string of them, flower, 4 curves in a lotus shape, and a cluster of 4 dots at the bottom, but none of the others. Jack set it back down, and it scampered off, beautiful spring green, almost disappearing into the grass. Man, Aster was good at this. Jack flushed a little. That was kind of a silly thought. Of course Aster was going to be good at it, but even so, it was true. Now that he was looking more closely at the eggs he was passing, all of the designs melted into those words, so many he didn't know, graceful lines and points and dots and circles. It was beautiful. He looked up and realized he was nearer to the eggplant field than he'd thought. He could see Aster seated beside a small herd of eggs himself, intently painting one in a blue so bright Jack could see it from here. Aster sat on his haunches, long feet flat on the ground and knees curved up like a true rabbit's legs, and it would have looked strange to someone else maybe, but not to Jack. That was just how Aster worked, the way he moved. It looked natural on him, even if Jack kind of thought he would be confused by it if he had just had someone describing it to him. The egg in his hood bounced up again and down into Jack's waiting hand. "All right, little guy," Jack said, taking a deep breath. "Let's get this over with." He straightened his spine and marched over, the eggs parting around him curiously. Rosebud," Aster called, catching sight of him. Jack's stomach did the happy squirming thing it always did when he earned the name. Aster stood, looked around himself, and looked back up as Jack approached. He looked a bit sheepish, and Jack grinned. He'd been right on the nose, then. "Sorry," Aster said when Jack got nearer. "That impatient blood is. What'd you go there?" Jack breathed in and out, trying to be casual. It was fine. He hadn't done anything wrong. It had just gotten a bit out of hand, and they would fix it. It would be fine. Jack's mouth clearly didn't get the memo. "Okay, so I was painting the eggs, which was fine. You were right. It does go pretty fast once you're in the swing of things, and the colors were really pretty, so, good choices there. But then I looked up and they weren't there, so I went looking, but I didn't see anything, and I'm pretty sure I've been to one end of the warren and back at this point, and they all gone, and..." "Whoa, crikey, hold up," Aster said, holding up a paw and looking a bit confused. To be fair, Jack wasn't sure any of those words were distinguishable from the others, or if he'd actually managed to make words at all. For all he knew, he'd opened his mouth and begun to whistle like a teakettle. It was hard to tell, especially with the way the egg in his hood began to headbutt his ear. What's this all about? I lost the eggs! Jack burst out, frustrated with his own inability to talk and the headbutting both. And this egg won't stop freaking out! He fished it out of his hood and shoved it at Aster, because if it knocked into his skull one more time, he was pitching it into the river. Aster nearly fumbled the egg, staring at it, then looking back up to Jack. Wait, you lost? Jack, suddenly wordless, nodded and braced himself, whether for disappointment or something worse, he wasn't sure. Then, oh God, then everything changed! Aster began to laugh, loud and full, and from the center of it, barking laughter like the sound of spring storms shaking trees, and Jack gaped as the light in his chest flared up dazzle bright. He knew that laughter, knew the sound and tone and shape of it, even if he'd not heard it out of Aster's mouth before. That was success! That was the way someone laughed when a great trick had proved fruitful, when a prank had gone right, when a joke was well told. And the way the light in his chest reacted, the way his heart fluttered, told him three things. One, he'd been fucking had. Two, his light, his center, was happiness. Laughter, maybe? Joy? Fun? He knew what it was now. He could figure out its name later. 3, he was, oh God, in love with Aster. Jack stared at Aster, and on loop in his head was a single word. Fuck. Aster couldn't help it. The laughter had been waiting all day for this moment, from the second he'd come up with the idea. He couldn't have kept it in if he tried, he didn't think. That is, until he looked away from the goog and saw Jack's panicked expression. "Oh, shut," he said, the laughter dying a quick death on his lips. "No, you're fine. Look." He turned and scrambled for his spare water jar, still unclouded by paint and freezing from the spring he pulled the water from, and turned back to Jack, who was still staring. "Look," Aster repeated a bit desperately, and wrapped the squirming goog in it. The cold did her work, and the shell went from white to the violet blue he'd left for Jack in the paint bottles. It was an even coat from what Aster could see through the distortion of the jar, pretty in the way all things that color are. And he held the jar out to Jack. "Wait," Jack said, taking the jar and holding it up, looking at the swimming goog. It was now doing circles through the water, showing off its pretty paint. "Invisible paint!" If Aster blushed like humans did, he was fair certain he'd be the darkest red Jack had ever seen. As it was, his ears were flat to his head, and he could feel his tail twitching. He couldn't believe he'd been so daft. Of course Jack would panic. This had to be the least intelligent thing he'd done in centuries. Yeah," Aster said, heart gone heavy in his chest. "Takes 5 minutes to go invisible, and the color comes back when it gets cold." "You pranked me!" Aster opened his mouth to begin apologizing, words already on his tongue, but was interrupted. Jack was laughing so hard that he actually sat down in the grass, sloshing water from the jar over himself. It sounded relieved and surprised, and so wonderful that Aster had to physically stop himself from sweeping Jack up and holding tightly, from wrapping himself around him and never letting go. "Oh my God!" Jack was sputtering out, and when he looked up, his blue eyes were electric. Aster looked briefly at the egg he'd just been painting. The color still wasn't right. There would be a lot of blue eggs this year, he reckoned, as he tried to imitate the brightness before him. His eyes couldn't be kept from Jack for long, though. "You pranked me! How did you even think of that? I can't believe... I was so worried, and you're telling me..." Aster began to laugh again, too, relief in his own chest. He took a seat beside Jack on the grass and watched as Jack poured out the goog onto the ground, only to have it scamper up onto his lap, dripping wet. "And you!" Jack said to the goog. "You were trying to tell me you were right there on the lawn, weren't you?" The goog bounced twice, looking quite pleased with itself, even as it warmed up and began to fade back in white. "Was this the first goog you painted?" Aster asked. "Yeah," Jack said, and frowned at it thoughtfully. After a second, he poked it with a finger, and frost spilled over its shell in neat fern patterns before the violet color came back. It spun twice, show pony, Aster thought fondly, and bounced again. "The first one painted always has the most personality," Aster said, holding out a paw. It leapt from Jack's knee into his palm, and Aster stood. "So I keep 'em." "Wait, you keep some?" Jack asked, scrambling to his feet too. "Yep, for every year I've done this," Aster agreed, thinking of the room where they usually spent their time, a couple hundred googs beneath a white willow tree. "You want to see?" "What about the painting, though?" Jack said, and looked nervous again. "I mean, I stopped to go find the eggs I'm behind now." Aster saw exactly where this was going and cut in. "We've started a whole day early this year, Frostbite," he said, and set a paw on Jack's shoulder. "No dramas. We're not behind." "Really?" Jack said, and smiled up at Aster, the nerves bleeding out of him. Oh, but a bit of tension, and though Aster wanted to soothe it, he didn't know its source. "You've thought of everything, Cottontail." Jack looked down at the goog still in Aster's other paw, and his smile grew. "Cold, huh? So these eggs are for where it's still going to be snowy, right?" Aster twitched his ears, pleased about himself. "Got it in one, you clever thing," he said, and Jack laughed. Aster, for one moment, rested in the sublime feeling of having caused that, of having been a source of happiness for Jack. It was the best he had felt in centuries, save for every other time he'd gotten to see Jack smile or laugh, or even the 3 times, wonderful, wonderful times, he'd gotten to hold Jack in his arms. "Hey, Bun-Bun." Aster smiled down at Jack. "Dear Frostbite." "Thanks," Jack said after a moment, looking down. There was a hint of a flush along his cheeks. Embarrassment likely, but it was a lovely sight to see. Then he looked up, and the grin on his mouth fair made Aster's heart stop. The hope Aster could feel in him did nothing to produce the sensation. "But I'm going to get you back for that." Aster couldn't help the laughter again. "That's what I was counting on," he replied, and Jack lit up, eyes and hope and grin alike. "Now let's get the little blighter in with the others, yeah? And I think," he said, twitching his ears as an idea began to spark in his brain, "I might have an idea for the next jockey. It's going to be your favorite." "But it won't," Jack challenged as they began to walk, eyes blue and grin wide. Aster let his paw remain on Jack's shoulder as they went, and was content.